I don't know why I agreed to go. I had plenty of reasons not to. Work was piling up, I had things to do at home, and the idea of spending a long weekend alone in the middle of nowhere never really appealed to me. But my cousin, Ryan, had insisted. He had just bought the place a few months ago, an old hunting cabin deep in the northern woods of Wisconsin. Isolated, quiet. Just go up there for a few days, he'd said. Check it out, make sure everything's good. I haven't had time. He'd offered me money for it, too. That's what convinced me. So I packed a bag, loaded up my truck, and started driving. The farther north I got, the thinner the roads became. What started as a smooth highway turned into cracked pavement, then gravel, then finally, just a narrow dirt path winding through thick forest. I hadn't seen another car for almost an hour. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches tangled like veins. It felt like I was driving into a tunnel of green and brown, the daylight barely making it through. The GPS on my phone had given up miles ago, leaving me with just the rough directions Ryan had texted me. Follow the dirt road for about 10 miles past the last gas station. You'll see a turnoff with an old mailbox. That's the driveway. Simple enough. I spotted the mailbox exactly where he said it would be. Rusted, leaning, barely standing. The driveway wasn't much of a road at all, just 2 tire tracks leading deeper into the woods. I turned in, the truck bouncing over the uneven ground. My stomach felt tight. The trees seemed even taller here, closing in. It was completely silent. No wind, no birds. The only sound was the crunch of my tires over dead leaves. Then I saw the cabin. First impressions. It was small, 1 story, made of dark, weathered logs. The roof was metal, rusted in places. A porch wrapped around the front, the railing old and splintered. There was a single window next to the door, a curtain pulled across it. Everything looked normal, but I still felt uneasy. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a minute. The silence was heavy. I realized I was holding my breath. I let it out, grabbed my bag, and stepped out. The cabin smelled like damp wood and earth. The air was thick, humid despite the cool temperature. I climbed the porch steps, the boards creaking under my weight. The door was locked. Good. That meant no one had been here. I used the key Ryan had given me, stepped inside, and shut the door behind me. The air was stale, like the place hadn't been opened in weeks. Dust floated in the dim light. The layout was simple. 1 big room with a kitchen on one side and a sleeping area on the other. A wood stove sat in the corner, a stack of logs beside it. There was no electricity, just an old lantern on the table, a few candles, and a battery-powered radio. I set my bag down and took a deep breath. It felt off. Not wrong exactly, just strange, like the cabin was holding its breath. I shook the feeling off, checked the cabinets, and made sure there was nothing weird inside. Just a few cans of soup, some coffee, and a bag of rice. Everything was fine. But then I noticed something. The bed. The blanket was pulled back, like someone had slept there recently. I stood frozen for a second, staring at it. Ryan hadn't been up here in months. No one else was supposed to be here. I told myself maybe he had just forgotten. Maybe he had come up once, crashed here for a night, and didn't remember. But that tight feeling in my gut didn't go away. I lit the lantern, made some instant coffee, and sat on the porch for a while. The trees stretched out in every direction, endless and dark. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. The sun dipped lower, the sky turning from deep blue to black. I went inside, locked the door, and lay down on the cot. I didn't sleep well. I woke up around 2 a.m. Something had woken me. A sound. Soft, subtle. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving outside the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the porch. I waited. Minutes passed. Then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I opened the door. The ground outside was damp, the morning dew clinging to the grass. There were footprints in the dirt, bare feet. They led from the woods to the porch, then back again. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my throat. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. just endless woods stretching out in every direction. I told myself it had to be an animal, a trick of the light, but I knew better. Someone had been here, watching. I should have left, but I didn't. I convinced myself it was nothing, just a weird coincidence. Maybe some hiker passing through. I locked the door, made sure the windows were secured, and sat at the table with my flashlight and knife. And I waited. The night stretched on, long and silent. Then, around midnight, the sounds started again. Footsteps, slow, moving back and forth outside. I gripped the knife, my hands slick with sweat. Then the doorknob rattled. Not hard, not aggressive, just testing. A slow, deliberate turn, like someone was seeing if it was locked. I held my breath. The knob rattled once more, then silence. Whoever was out there, they didn't leave right away. I could feel them standing there, waiting. I didn't sleep. At first light, I grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and started the engine. As I pulled out, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The footprints were back. But this time, they weren't just around the cabin. They led from the woods to the door, then around the truck. Someone had been standing right next to it. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until I was miles away, until I had service again, until the cabin was just a bad memory. I called Ryan and told him everything was fine. I never told him about the footprints. I never told him about the doorknob. And I never went back, because whoever was out there, they wanted me to stay, and I wasn't going to give them that chance. I never should have gone up there alone. It's easy to say that now, after everything that happened, but even before I left, something in me was telling me not to go. A bad feeling, a knot in my stomach, that quiet voice in the back of my mind whispering that I was making a mistake. But I went anyway. It was supposed to be simple 3 days alone in my friend's cabin, deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. Just a short getaway, a chance to disconnect from everything. No service, no people, just me, a few books, and the quiet of the forest. I wasn't looking for adventure. I wasn't trying to test myself. I just wanted some time alone. I got more than that. The road stretched out in front of me, long and empty. I had been driving for almost 4 hours, the last 2 on nothing but dirt and gravel. The farther I went, the fewer signs of life I saw. No gas stations, no houses, not even another car. Just endless trees on either side, dark and close, pressing in. I kept telling myself it was fine. This was exactly what I wanted: peace, isolation. But something about the road unsettled me. It wasn't just the emptiness. It was the feeling that I was being watched. The way the trees seemed to lean in, their branches tangled like fingers. The way my headlights barely cut through the dim light, even though it was only mid-afternoon. I turned up the music, trying to shake the feeling, but it didn't help. It took another hour before I finally reached the turnoff. A narrow, overgrown path barely wide enough for my truck. The sign was old, half buried in weeds. Private property, no trespassing. It wasn't welcoming, but I knew I was in the right place. I took a deep breath and turned in. The cabin sat at the end of the path, hidden in a clearing. Small, simple, made of dark wood with a slanted metal roof. A porch wrapped around the front, the railing worn and splintered. There was a fire pit a few feet away, a stack of logs beside it. It looked exactly how my friend, Kyle, had described it. Except for one thing, the door was open, just a crack, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I pulled up and killed the engine, listening. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe Kyle had forgotten to close it properly the last time he was here. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. I grabbed my bag and walked up slowly. The wood creaked under my boots. I pushed the door open the rest of the way. The inside was dim, dust floating in the air. A single room, bed in one corner, small kitchen on the other side, a table and 2 chairs in the middle. A wood stove near the back wall, cold and dark. It looked untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here. I checked the cabinets, the small fridge. Nothing seemed out of place. The windows were locked. I told myself it was fine. I latched the door shut, dropped my bag by the bed, and tried to ignore the uneasy feelings settling in my chest. I didn't sleep well. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds outside. The wind moving through the trees, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the woods. Normal forest noises. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I held my breath, my heart pounding. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the front door. I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then the footsteps moved away. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, waiting for them to come back. They didn't. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was just an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a coyote. I almost convinced myself. I spent the morning chopping wood, trying to keep busy. The uneasy feeling hadn't left me, but the daylight made it easier to ignore. Then I found the tracks. They were in the dirt near the fire pit. Footprints, bare feet. The prints were deep, the toes dug into the earth. Whoever had been here had been standing there for a while, watching. My mouth went dry. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. Just endless woods stretching out in every direction. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was overreacting. I locked the door. I checked the windows 3 times. I sat at the table with my knife and flashlight, waiting. The night stretched on, long and silent. Then, around midnight, the sounds started again. Footsteps, slow, moving back and forth outside the cabin. I held my breath. Then something else. A soft scratching at the front door. Not knocking, not pounding, just scratching, like someone dragging their nails down the wood. I gripped the knife, my palms slick with sweat. The scratching stopped. Then a new sound. The doorknob rattled. I nearly dropped the knife. The rattling lasted only a few seconds. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. The sun couldn't come fast enough. The moment there was enough light, I grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and started the engine. As I pulled out, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The footprints were back. But this time, they were different. They weren't just around the cabin. They led from the woods, to the door, then back to the woods. A trail, coming and going, like someone had been waiting, like someone had been coming back. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until I saw people, until I had service again. I never told Kyle what happened. I never went back, and I never will. I don't know why I went up there alone. Looking back, there were plenty of times I could have turned around and gone home, but I didn't. I kept driving, deeper into the mountains, farther away from everything, convincing myself it would be fine. Started as a simple favor. My uncle Jim owned a small cabin up in the northern woods of Idaho. It was an old hunting cabin, nothing fancy, just a single-room structure with a stove, a cot, and some basic supplies. He used it a lot when he was younger, but over the years he'd stopped going as much. He still kept it up, though made sure it was in decent shape. A week ago, he called me and asked if I could check on it. Said he had a bad feeling. He'd been planning to go himself, but he was getting too old for the trip. He told me someone had been messing around up there. A few weeks back, a couple of hikers had told him they saw movement near the cabin, figures slipping through the trees. They hadn't gotten a good look, but it was enough to make him uneasy. He just wanted me to drive up, take a look around, make sure everything was fine. It wasn't. The road was worse than I remembered. It had been years since I'd been up there, and the dirt path had nearly disappeared in some places. Tall trees pressed in on both sides, their branches stretching overhead, blocking out the sky. The farther I went, the less I liked it. It was early evening when I finally pulled up. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods. It looked the same, weathered logs, rusted metal roof, a small porch out front. But something felt off. I sat in my truck for a minute, just looking at it. The door was closed. No broken windows. No sign of anyone. Maybe it was just my imagination. Still, my stomach felt tight. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The inside was exactly how I expected. Dusty, dim, stale air. A small wooden table sat near the window, a few chairs pushed against the wall. The old cot was in the corner, the mattress thin and worn. Everything was where it should be, but something didn't feel right. I checked the cabinets. A few canned goods, some old coffee, a box of matches. The stove was cold. No signs of a fire in weeks. I told myself it was fine. Locked up, untouched. I just needed to stay the night and head back in the morning. That was the plan. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Sometime past midnight, I heard it. A noise outside. Soft, slow, footsteps. I held my breath. The steps moved along the side of the cabin. Careful, deliberate. I sat up, gripping my flashlight. My knife was in my bag near the door. Too far. The footsteps stopped. I waited, counted the seconds. Then the sound of the doorknob turning. My body locked up. The metal handle rattled once, twice, then stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I stayed awake, gripping the flashlight, listening to my heartbeat hammer in my ears. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe hours, but nothing happened. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself to open the door. The ground outside was damp from the morning dew, and there they were, footprints, bare footprints. They led from the woods to the door, circled the cabin once, then disappeared back into the trees. I swallowed hard. I should have left right then, but I told myself it could have been a hiker, maybe someone lost. The footprints didn't look fresh. Maybe it had been days ago. I kept lying to myself. I made some coffee, sat on the porch, and tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. By midday, I had almost convinced myself that it was nothing. Then I found the carving. It was on the backside of the cabin, scratched into the wood. Deep, jagged letters, uneven like they had been carved in a hurry. Help me. I stared at it, my skin crawling. The letters were rough, desperate. Whoever had done it hadn't been playing around. I stepped back, my pulse pounding. The woods behind the cabin were dense, nearly impenetrable. But standing there, I felt something I hadn't before. Like the trees weren't empty, like someone was there, watching. I should have left. I should have grabbed my bag and driven out of there as fast as possible. But I didn't. I told myself it was just some prank, maybe left by a hiker years ago. I locked the door early, made sure the windows were secured. I kept my knife next to me, and I waited. Sometime past midnight, it started again. Footsteps, slow, careful, moving around the cabin. I held my breath. Then something else. Scraping. A slow, dragging sound, like metal against wood, came from the porch. I gripped my knife, every muscle in my body tense. Then silence. I stayed awake the entire night. I never heard them leave. To first light, I opened the door. The footprints were back, circling the cabin. But this time, they weren't alone. There were handprints, too, on the porch, on the door. Long, smeared streaks in the dust, like someone had been clawing at the wood. I didn't think. I didn't pack. I just grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and drove. I didn't look back. I never told my uncle the full story, just said everything looked fine, that the cabin was locked up and safe. I didn't want to scare him, but I knew I would never go back. 2 months later, the Forest Service found a body. A man. They said he had been dead for months, maybe longer. They found him deep in the woods, curled against the base of a tree. His fingers were raw down to the bone, like he had been clawing at something, trying to get inside. And when they showed a picture of him, I felt my stomach drop, because I had seen that jacket before, crumpled in the corner of the cabin. I don't know why I agreed to go alone. I should have said no. I should have told my brother to figure it out himself, but I didn't. And now, looking back, I think about how many times I could have just turned around and gone home. It started with a favor. My brother, Mark, owns a small hunting cabin up in northern Montana. It's not fancy, just a one-room wooden structure with a stove, a cot, and some basic supplies. He mostly uses it during deer season, but sometimes he rents it out to friends or coworkers. He called me on a Wednesday night, said he was in a bind. A friend of his had borrowed the cabin for a weekend and left in a rush, forgetting to lock up properly. Just go up there, check the place out, lock the door and come back, he'd said. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. The drive alone was a nightmare. Miles of empty road, then dirt trails twisting through the trees. But Mark had helped me out plenty of times, so I figured I owed him. Besides, it was only an hour and a half away. I'd be in and out in 20 minutes. That was the plan anyway. The road got worse the farther I went. At first, it was just cracked pavement, then loose gravel, and then nothing but dirt and mud. I hadn't been to the cabin in years, and I forgot how isolated it was. No cell service, no gas stations, no signs of life for miles. Just trees on either side, towering and thick, blocking out the sun. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by woods. It looked the same as I remembered: dark wood, a metal roof, a single window on the side. The front door was slightly open, just like Mark had said. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the place. It felt off. Not in a supernatural way, but in a real gut-level way. Like when you come home and something in your house isn't where you left it. I grabbed the flashlight from my glove box. The sun was getting low, and I didn't want to be fumbling around in the dark. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The smell hit me first: stale air, damp wood, and something else, something faintly sour. I stepped inside and shone my flashlight around. The cabin was a mess. The cot was pushed away from the wall. The small wooden table was knocked over. A chair lay on its side. The cabinets above the counter hung open, and a few cans of food were scattered on the floor. It didn't look like a bear. Bears tear through places, ripping things apart. This looked more deliberate. I took a slow breath and moved deeper inside. The place was cold, colder than it should have been. I checked the stove off, but the ashes inside were fresh. Someone had been here recently. I crouched near the cot and saw something on the floor. A jacket. A man's jacket, crumpled in the corner. It wasn't Mark's. I stood up quickly, scanning the room. No signs of anyone. No footprints in the dust near the door. I was alone, but I didn't feel alone. I should have left right then, locked the door and driven back. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe Mark's friend had just been careless. Maybe he'd been drinking, knocked some things over, and left in a hurry. I set the table back up, picked up the cans, and straightened the cot. I didn't see the point in staying, but by then the sun was almost gone. Driving those winding roads in the dark wasn't appealing. I decided to stay the night. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot. I kept my flashlight next to me, along with the hunting knife I found in the drawer. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night was silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just thick, heavy quiet. I woke up around 2 a.m. Something had woken me. A sound outside. I held my breath and listened. A branch snapping. It was close, just outside the cabin. I slowly reached for my flashlight. My fingers closed around the handle, but I didn't turn it on. I waited, straining my ears. Footsteps, soft, careful, moving around the cabin. My pulse hammered. I thought about calling out, but who was I expecting to answer? The footsteps stopped. Silence. I lay there, barely breathing. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Then the sound of the doorknob turning. I bolted upright, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. The knob rattled once, twice, then stopped. Whoever it was, they were still out there. I didn't sleep again. I sat up until the sky started turning gray, gripping the knife so tightly my hand ached. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself to open the door. The ground was damp from the morning dew, and sure enough, there were footprints in the mud. Bare footprints, not animal tracks, human. I locked up the cabin, threw my gear in the truck, and got the hell out of there. But the weirdest part? When I checked my phone, I had service again. Just enough to call Mark. I told him what happened. He was quiet for a long time, then said, "Yeah, that's why I stopped using the place." I asked him what he meant. He sighed. "You remember that guy I rented it to last year? The one who disappeared?" I did. The guy had gone up for a weekend and never came back. Authorities searched the area but never found him. Mark hesitated. Then he said, "I think he never left, and that was the last time I ever set foot in that cabin." I don't know why I thought a solo trip to a cabin would be a good idea. Maybe it was the stress. Work had been grinding me down for months. Long hours, no breaks, constant deadlines. I felt like I was losing my mind. Every day was the same: wake up, work, sleep, repeat. I needed a break, something to reset my head. The idea came from a friend. He'd gone on a similar trip, just him, a cabin, and nature. No distractions, he had told me. Just quiet. That sounded perfect. I found a rental listing online. A small place deep in the woods of northern Montana. It looked simple: one bedroom, a fireplace, a kitchen. Far enough from the nearest town that I wouldn't have to deal with people. That was the goal. No emails, no meetings, no noise. Just me, a few books, and the quiet of the woods. So, I packed up, filled my truck's tank, and started driving. It was a long drive, 6 hours from home, the last 2 on dirt roads that barely looked like they were meant for cars. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of life I saw. No houses, no farms, just trees. Endless trees, stretching out on both sides of the road. It was late October, and the air had that sharp, cold edge that came right before winter. The sky was overcast, dull gray, making the forest feel even darker. About 5 miles from the cabin, my phone lost service. That was expected, but it still unsettled me. I had downloaded an offline map just in case, but there was something about knowing I was completely cut off that made my stomach tighten. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. It was smaller than I expected. 1 story, dark wood, steep roof, a narrow porch wrapped around the front, and there was a small shed to the side. The windows were dark, the only light coming from the porch lantern, which flickered weakly. The driveway was empty. The owner had told me he'd leave the key under the mat. I stepped inside, and the air smelled like wood and dust. The cabin was simple, just a living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. Old furniture, mismatched dishes, a few framed pictures on the walls. The place felt untouched, like no one had been here in a long time. It was quiet, too quiet. I shook it off, unpacked my things, and started a fire. That first night, I barely slept. I never wanted to go to the cabin. It was my brother's idea, one of those last-minute, half-baked plans that sounded fine over the phone but felt wrong the moment I packed my bags. He had found it online, some rental deep in the Montana woods. No nearby towns, no cell phone service, just an isolated wooden box buried in miles of trees. A getaway from life, he called it. I should have said no, but I didn't. I took a week off work, packed up my truck, and drove 12 hours straight to meet him. The road got worse the farther I went. Cracked asphalt turning to dirt, then to something barely a road at all. It was past sunset when I reached the turnoff. A narrow path of gravel led through the thick woods, my headlights slicing through the dark like a knife. It was dead silent, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. No wind, no birds, nothing. By the time I saw the cabin, my gut was already tight. It was small, old-looking but sturdy, its logs dark with age. A single porch light flickered weakly above the door. My brother's truck was parked beside it, coated in dust. I killed my engine and stepped out. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for late September. I could see my breath as I grabbed my bag and walked up the creaking steps. The door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood and something else, something faintly sour. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots as I walked in. A fireplace sat cold against the far wall, a couch and a wooden table filling the small living space. To my right, a tiny kitchen. Straight ahead, a hallway led to the bedrooms. "Matt," I called out. No answer. I dropped my bag and walked down the hall. The first door on the left was open. Inside, a single bed, a dresser, and my brother's bag shoved into the corner. His clothes were tossed on the bed like he had unpacked in a hurry. But he wasn't there. I checked the next room. Empty. Bathroom? Empty. Back in the kitchen, I found an open beer on the counter, still half full. His keys were there too. That was the first thing that really bothered me. Matt never left his keys behind. Something felt wrong. I grabbed my phone, but of course no signal. No Wi-Fi either. I told myself he had probably gone for a walk. But as I stood there in that silent cabin, I knew that wasn't true. Something was off. I waited. An hour. 2. By midnight, the woods outside felt like a wall pressing in. I stepped onto the porch, my flashlight sweeping over the trees. Nothing but darkness. I called his name again. My voice felt swallowed by the night. Then I saw them. Footprints, leading from the porch into the woods. Not his boot prints. Bare feet. The tracks were fresh, crisp in the dirt, leading straight into the blackness between the trees. I should have left right then. Should have grabbed my bag, jumped in my truck, and floored it. But I didn't, because it made no sense. I grabbed my flashlight and followed them. The woods were dead quiet. My boots crunched over dry leaves, but that was the only sound. I kept my beam on the prints. They were small, uneven, like someone had been limping. They led deeper, winding between the trees. Then they stopped, right in the middle of a small clearing. No sign of where they went next. I turned in a slow circle, my light cutting through the trees. My breath came fast now, my chest tight. The woods felt wrong, like they were watching me. Then I heard it, a rustling. Not the wind, not an animal, something moving. I turned fast, my flashlight catching something pale just beyond the trees. A shape, person. I froze. It was a man, standing just at the edge of my light. His skin was pale, almost gray. His chest bare, ribs sharp under his skin. His hair was long, matted. His face hollow, sunken eyes locked onto me. And he was smiling. I took a step back. He didn't move, just stood there, grinning, his head tilting slightly, like he was waiting. I don't remember running. I just remember bursting into the cabin, slamming the door, locking it. My hands shook as I grabbed my keys from the counter. I was already halfway to my truck when I stopped. My tires were slashed, every single one. Deep, deliberate cuts. That's when I knew I was trapped. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with a kitchen knife gripped in my hand, staring at the door. Every noise made my skin crawl. The wind, the creak of wood, the distant snap of a branch. I kept picturing that man, his grin, the way he stood so still. Morning came slow. The woods looked normal in daylight, but I wasn't stupid. I needed to get out. I grabbed my bag, stuffed everything inside. My truck was useless, but I had seen a gas station a few miles back on the road in. If I walked fast, I could make it. I was halfway down the gravel path when I saw something that stopped me cold. Footprints. Not the ones from last night. New ones, leading from the woods to the cabin, leading to the front door. Someone had been there, standing just outside while I sat inside all night. Watching. I ran. I made it to the gas station just before noon, breathless, sweating despite the cold. The old man behind the counter barely looked up as I stumbled in. "Everything all right?" he asked. "No," I swallowed. "I need to call the cops." His expression changed then. A slow shift, like he already knew. He picked up the landline, dialed, then handed it to me. The sheriff showed up an hour later. I told him everything. He listened, nodding, but his face stayed unreadable. When I was done, he sighed. "You're lucky," he said. "Lucky." I stared at him. "My brother's missing. Some guy was watching me all night." He nodded again like he had heard it before. "That cabin," he said slowly. "No one's rented it for years. Not since the last incident." I felt my stomach drop. "What incident?" He didn't answer right away, just looked out toward the woods. "Couple went missing there. Never found. Just disappeared." He turned back to me. No sign of struggle, no forced entry, just gone. I felt sick. They searched. A whole team went up there, combed the woods, found my brother's bag, his boots, but not him, not anything else. It's been 3 years. Matt never turned up. No calls, no sightings, just a name added to a growing list of disappearances. And me? I don't go near the woods anymore. I moved south, far from the tree lines, far from the dark. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see him again. That man, that smile. And I wonder how many others saw it too, right before they disappeared.